folks. This is a podcast about Catholic things. I'm Eric Engel. You're
I'm Dan Engel.
You just wait your turn before you talk.
All right,
you
sorry,
wait
man.
for me to introduce you?
Go ahead,
Okay.
do it.
This is Dan Engel. Now talk.
Okay, hi guys.
Okay, we're talking about the third temptation of Christ. Last week we did the second, and the week before that we did the first. And this is the one that, as a kid, I always scratched my head at this one because, as it looks to me, we've got God, the creator of all things, the King of Kings, being told by the devil, who is subject to him, that if he worships him, then he'll give him all this ruling power, which he didn't need. And that always confused the heck out of me.
Yeah, it did me too for very much the same reasons. And this is one that I kind of hit upon this. And I'll tell you when. It was during the time when I don't know if it was live action or if it was some other group but they were basically going in and doing their kind of undercover at Planned Parenthood and going acting the part of pimps running underage girls and that kind of stuff and I mean they were doing a wonderful job of really exposing the deep evil that Planned Parenthood is, and I salute their work absolutely. But there was, for a brief time, a concern that some people brought up about, hey, wait a minute, as Christians, should we support this kind of activity since it involves lying? And so that was kind of like this sort of test case thing for me. And personally, I'm one of those who believes that every lie is an offense to God, that to be quiet and to simply not speak, there are plenty of times when that's okay. Even if somebody asks a question, if they don't really have a right to the answer, to simply not answer might be okay. But to state a falsehood is so contrary to the nature of God that it can't fail to offend him. So even things like undercover detective work and lying to suspects under interrogation and stuff like that, things that have a real, we've come to accept them as having a real expedient value in our society. There's a question there about where does that come in terms of a Christian perspective and the offense to God that lies must have. It was.
What about your wife?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta.
Does this make me look fat?
Yeah, it's I mean, do you change the subject? And would she see through
That's
that?
What I do.
So it was while thinking about this that it kind of occurred to me then what the third temptation is all about. Because as you said, I mean, okay, everything belongs to God anyway, and he doesn't have to worship Satan in order to have dominion over it. Why would he even be tempted to? But I think that what was going on here was that Satan was offering a bargain. Now, a bargain he never intended to follow through on, being the father of lies himself. In fact, I think it's interesting that's a specific title that God gives to Satan, the father of lies. Jesus refers to him as the father of lies. That shows how much lying is contrary to the nature of God. But the offer that Satan's making is, hey, all you have to do is perform one little act of worship. It doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't involve malice towards anybody. It's a victimless sin, if you will. And I'm gone. I'm out of here. I'll back off and I'll quit trying to incite people to do evil. I'll quit trying to cause natural disasters that create suffering for people. I'll quit trying to turn people away from God. It'll all be over. And you can go on then ruling the world according to your peaceful designs. And I think that's the temptation that so many of us face in our own lives, is this idea that by performing some little seemingly inconsequential act of wrong, we can bring some great good out of it. Of course, one of the cases where this kind of conflict comes into place, and when you say, well, lying's always wrong, you try to make that case to somebody, and they always want to bring out an example like, what if you're hiding Jews from the Nazis in your basement? Well, shouldn't you lie in order to save their life? Well, I don't want to. I don't want to ever call out somebody as doing wrong who is hiding Jews in their basement or hiding black slaves on the Underground Railroad for lying in order to maintain that and keep that going. It's I'm not here to condemn anybody for that. However, if we look a little bit more closely at the third temptation and its meaning, when Jesus was offered this, he knew everything that was going to happen throughout history. He knew the entire, 20th century history. He knew that all those Jews were going to be killed by the Nazi regime because of the work of Satan. He knew the tens of millions that would be killed by Stalin because of the work of Satan. And all of the other smaller in numbers but no less significant genocides of the 20th century. He also knew.
Stopped it.
Presumably that's the temptation. He could have stopped it with a simple act of worshiping Satan that wouldn't in itself have seemed consequential to anybody. Now, of course, that would have been the end of his mission. At that point, it all would have been over. However, there's a deeper point here, which is that Jesus had such a complete trust of the Father that he knew to trust the Father's dominion over all these matters in spite of an apparent opportunity to accomplish this great good or to avoid some great evil with an act which would just be a matter of disobeying God, but not of any other consequence. And I think that's where sometimes it comes to us. I mean, we've got the lies that we tell in order to maybe take advantage of some sale, employees,
or to make your wife happy.
Or to make your wife happy. Employees and family only. Well, okay, I'll call you my brother. When we went to the zoo as Cub Scouts, the den mother said, "Oh yeah, these are all my children," in order to save on parking or something like that. But sorry, I just lost my mouse. Just the mouse. Hold on, I think I'm okay.
The mouse. Okay. What are you doing with the mouse?
That's what I do. I use a mouse.
You hold the mouse. Are you talking to it?
Computer. So
okay.
So the point is, there's all these temptations to accomplish minor things, and sometimes there's temptations to accomplish big things or to avoid big things by doing some little inconsequential act of disobedience to God. And that's the temptation that Jesus had. But in order to avoid that, it requires a really supreme trust that God has it in hand. Now, let's take what that trust would mean, back to the question of somebody hiding Jews from the Nazis. When you lie, if you've got Jews in your basement, you lie to, the Gestapo that stops by or whatever. Let's first of all be a little bit real. Okay, yes, your lie maybe saves their lives, but in terms of motivation, you're lying as much to save your own life and to avoid your own punishment as you are to save them. Now, again, I'm not going to call out as doing something wrong or as making the wrong decision, or I'm not going to condemn anybody who would lie in a situation like that, or who has lied in a situation like that. Hats off to so many people. This is just a hypothetical thing, and it's just kind of something to think about here in connection with this third temptation of Christ. What if the real plan of the Father, what if the will of the Father in his dominion over all things and his complete providence of all things was to be served not specifically by you saving your hide by telling that lie, or not even specifically by those particular Jews' lives being saved by you telling that lie, but rather by, for example, your witness to the wrongness of what was being done to them by placing yourself between the Nazis and them and taking the consequences of that by joining them in whatever was going to happen to them. Maybe that's what God might have been calling somebody to do in a situation like that. Now, again,
like Saint Maximilian.
Kind of like, yeah.
I wonder if we should tell that story.
Yeah, we should briefly. Yeah. So, okay. Do you know the backstory about the escape attempt?
I know that he was in a camp with Jews, and I think one escaped.
Either escaped or tried to escape. I forget whether there was really an escape, but
so the deal was he was going to the guard there was, or the warden was going to. He said he's going to kill 20 Jews to pay for the one that escaped.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and Maximilian had he had some kind of contact with one of them in there, and was trying to convince him that God does exist and God loves him, something like that.
I don't remember that part of it. What I remember is that one of the men who was going to be executed was a father. He had a family, and Saint Max. And by the way, this execution, it wasn't being marched out and shot. It was being starved to death. It was a very painful execution. So Maximilian Kolbe said, "This is just a numbers game to you. Take me instead of him."
Right. And then they put him in a little cell and stopped feeding them and stopped giving them water. How long? It was like 20 days.
Something like that. Yeah, just agonizing. I mean, you can only imagine. But yeah, that's a good. I hadn't even thought of Maximilian Kolbe when I was writing this stuff.
And all of those, from some of the accounts, all of those Jews were converted to Christians and were singing praises to God in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Maximilian lived longer than they wanted him to, so they finally shot him.
Yeah, something like that. So that's, but again, that's, look what he was able to do with his willingness to simply stand up and say, this is wrong, I'm going to join these people. And like I said, I'm not trying to say that people who lied their way along the moving Jews out of occupied areas or black people along the Underground Railroad or whatever. This isn't a condemnation of anything they've done or how they've handled it. It's just using the fact that these real situations did happen in history. It's just using that as a little bit of opportunity to reflect on this part of Scripture. That's what I'm doing here.
Because those are the kinds of things people always say, well, is it a sin in this case?
Right, right. They want to press the hard cases.
Yeah, okay. But if you have a principle and you want to really think about whether or not you believe in that, what you need to do is take it to an extreme and then test it.
Yeah. And
I mean, if you believe in this, then you believe in it all the time, and you can't just say it depends on the circumstances if it's an actual principle that you believe in.
right.
And that is what we're talking about.
Yeah. And, the principle of absolute trust in the Father and the Father's plan and the Father's dominion, that was the principle that was being tested in Jesus at this point.
The Jesuits, when they were being sent into England, back when they were putting Catholic priests to death, when they trained the Jesuits to come in and minister to the Catholics who were here, they would train them on how to dodge questions about being a priest without lying.
Oh, right. And some people think of that as a little bit of copping out, or of, okay, you're just misleading anyway. Why not just lie outright, and treating it as though it would have been the same? But that's
how the Jesuits got that reputation.
Right. But the thing is, there's a real case to be made, and they made it, and they, I think, had an understanding of this at that time, at least the Jesuits of that time, that it's not the allowing people to draw the wrong conclusion. The point is that they were trying to be true to is that the nature of God does not allow one to speak falsely, and that's what they were trying to avoid. Now, I had a thought in my head about that. It's gone.
While you're thinking about this, you must have dropped your mouse, and now you're lost.
That must be it.
It was the mouse.
Without the mouse, I'm lost.
So the Satan is tempting Jesus in this way, and had he given in, there would be a lot less war, supposedly, less natural disasters, less murder, and all the bad things that we do. But not a single person would have made it to heaven.
Right. And that's the, now, Jesus, of course, to the extent that a human would be capable of understanding, he understood his relationship to the Father, certainly. And he probably understood this as well. But that's really the temptation that Satan was laying down, I think, before Jesus. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I was going to say, even Jesus allowed people to draw the wrong conclusion sometimes. So, for example, when the apostles were talking about who was going to be, greater in the kingdom, and Jesus kind of came up on them, he knew what they were talking about, but he asked them, hey, what are y'all talking about? And, they all grew real quiet, of course, because they suddenly felt ashamed that they had been bickering over that. But just making the point that it's not that God doesn't allow people in their limited nature to misunderstand something, but God himself cannot issue a falsehood. And that's what the Jesuits were really being true to in that training you were talking about. But this third temptation, I mean, the lie thing, the reason the lie thing is such an easy one to come up with as a analogy for the temptation is because lying itself in many cases is inconsequential in a worldly sense. And so, so anyway, I think I've exhausted my thoughts on the third temptation.
Well, you know what, it kind of, to kind of flip that over, sometimes there is a temptation to, when we're doing something that we think needs to be done, or when we're doing God's will, mm-hmm. there's a sense of invincibility sometimes.
Right.
Because it's like the Blues Brothers when they were causing all that havoc, and he says, we're on a mission from God. And
yeah. People forget the difference between serving God, which we're called to do, and accomplishing God's work, which we don't do that. God does that. You know what I mean? So it's like almost, we feel as though, well, if we don't succeed at this, then we must have failed what God wants us to do. But no, not necessarily. God calls us to serve Him. He's the one who will accomplish in His time, according to His providence, whatever it is that needs to be accomplished. But it's not always the immediate objective that we're serving that's going to be accomplished in the world.
And if He wants it done, He'll do it. And if He wants to wait for a little while, that doesn't relieve us from the responsibility to try to make it happen or to do certain things.
Right.
We go to something like the fight on abortion. We grew up in a pro-life movement, and our parents were very heavily involved in the pro-life movement. And our mom's been to jail, I don't know how many times.
Mm-hmm. A few different cities and stuff, right.
I think it's been proven that during that whole protest movement, there were minds changed and there were babies saved.
Yeah.
So it definitely wasn't a worthless effort.
Right.
At
Without
the same time, they did not move the ball any closer to stopping abortion in America at all. I mean, it almost could make you feel like it was all worthless, but they still continue to do what they thought was the will of God, and they did actually make changes, but they were in much more personal ways. Here's President Trump, which kind of brings us to our current events. This is the guy who's just kind of loud and obnoxious, and he's constantly fighting on his Twitter account, but he might actually be the one who brings, I don't think it's going to bring an end to abortion in America, but he's going to stop a lot of legal abortions, hopefully, if things continue the way they're going.
Right. There's certainly a opportunity for him through his administration to move the needle in ways that those people during that protest time just didn't seem to be able to accomplish.
Yeah, and it wasn't just protesting. We were
the grassroots
part of political
movements.
Oh my gosh!
Yes. I mean,
so much time went into that, and it came to absolutely nothing. It was as if they hadn't done a single thing, and we can't really explain exactly what the movement was right now because it takes a little bit of time. It would take a lot of time, yeah. But it was a huge movement that thousands of people put tons of time into and money, and it just nothing happened. Here Trump comes along, and you're okay. Some people would argue against saying this is a servant of God or he's doing God's will, but he is accomplishing, hopefully, the will of God. Because there's no way that God wills for us to legally kill babies. Right. And he's doing it.
And I think that's, I think, if we're honest with ourselves, there's something, I don't want to speak badly, but there's something a little bit ignoble about Trump. How he does get into, petty fights and that kind of on Twitter and stuff like that. But if he ends up moving that needle in America with regards to abortion and reducing those abortions and allowing more lives to be lived, and possibly therefore allowing more people to be saved. Ultimately, a woman who decides not to have an abortion or who can't have an abortion is a woman who's not carrying around that guilt that, okay, yeah, in some cases that guilt ends up leading people to God, but in how many cases does it make them despair and then they never come to God?
Sure.
Well, so God is choosing perhaps this instrument, this, Donald Trump, to accomplish something that so many good people putting in so many hours of effort couldn't accomplish themselves. Yet they were no less called to serve that good of that fact that they didn't seem to accomplish it.
Yeah.
We don't test God by saying, hey, if we're doing your will, then you're going to bring fruit out of our labor.
Yeah. Instead, Trump's going to get fruit out of our labor. Abraham Lincoln. I mean, a lot of people compare him to, what's his name? Ronald Reagan, but I think Trump is a lot closer than we realize to Abraham Lincoln if he pulls this off. If he gets Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court and they finally at least allow states to make the decision on whether or not to legalize abortion.
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't see how you could deny it. I mean,
yeah, that would be
that's a huge step.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, as monumental as Lincoln's eventually
slavery.
bringing about the end of slavery.
You know what scares me? Have you ever read Lincoln's second inaugural address?
No.
You've probably heard it talked about, though. It's he talks about the fact that that slavery was something so bad that it took the Civil War to end it.
Mm-hmm.
And it took that amount of death because that sin had to be paid for. And God's justice had to be justified. And a lot of times I wonder,
is there going to be a similar calling
something has to happen.
task?
I feel like there's no way we're going to get out of this unscathed.
Mm-hmm.
As a country, we've been murdering children. There's got to be a consequence for that.
Right. I think,
I don't know.
That's, that could be, and here's, when you look at some of the left protest styles, I'll say, it's quite believable to say that to the degree that all of the peaceful and peaceable protesting and activities and so on that pro-life people have demonstrated, trying to not just bring an end to abortion, but trying to help individuals avoid even getting into that horror. All of that peaceable and peaceful work that they've done, there's good reason to believe that if laws start changing in big ways against abortion, as they should, those changes will be met with very non-peaceful resistance by those who want the abortion laws to stand.
It's kind of already happening, but not.
Yeah, you see it.
Not real bad yet.
Right. So there may be, even things that are the equivalents of, and I don't know what it would look like, but the equivalents of, mob lynchings and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I guess we'll have to wait and see, but it's something that I think we should all pray about and think about and just bear in mind as we go. It's
and be ready to witness.
Another couple months, we're headed towards November, and we're going to see what happens. But got to keep doing the right thing, and people got to vote. All right, I think that draws it to a close now.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Listening. This is a podcast about CatholicThings.com or APACT, APACT.us. And see you next week, and think about what we said.
Bye, everyone.